So I do this other workshop called Intro to Objects. And in that workshop, we start by creating an object. And then after the object is created, we move on to using a form container for entering data. And then using a collection display fragment for displaying the records that have been entered. There's also an administrative sort of function where you get a couple of buttons where you can approve and deny the request that the object represents. And it's all using out-of-the-box facilities of Liferay. And the value proposition there, as you've probably heard over the last 2 days, is it allows the citizen developer to create solutions on Liferay without having to write any code. And that is very valuable. But we get to the end of the workshop, and I point out that there are some problems with this implementation. In the forms container, it can't really take any sort of business rules or logic into play. So you can't do things like hide fields that shouldn't be displayed. You can't make really conditional fields that will go out and fetch information from an API in order to populate a dropdown. There are just things that you can't do with the out-of-the-box form container. Likewise, from the collection display perspective, my two buttons for approving and denying the request, they always show up. So even if you approve a request, the approve button is still there. So if you have business rules that say, well, if it's approved, then don't show the approve button, only show the deny button because maybe they want to deny. And maybe there's a business rule that says, you know, if they're going to deny one that's already been approved, maybe we need to prompt them and say, do you really want to deny this request? And the purpose of bringing this up is so that we can then go into the client extension, the custom element client extension. I write one in React and I provide it to them and we deploy it. And then we showcase it. And the React application has its own custom form with business rules that are built in there. It has the display listing. It knows if I'm an admin to show the buttons, and I can have the business logic tied to the buttons to change the state, to approve, to deny, make the buttons go away that shouldn't be visible. And the purpose is to show what we can do when the out-of-the-box stuff is not enough to cover our requirements. So that ends up being a powerful tool that we, as the developers who are targeting Liferay, it's something that we need to know how to do. Because any application that is going to be more complex that cannot be handled with the out-of-the-box components is really going to fall into a custom application in the classic sense, would have been a portlet in Liferay. But now what we want to do is leverage JavaScript frameworks, JavaScript applications, built as custom elements and deployed into Liferay as client extensions. That way they can live in Liferay, they can be as complicated as we need them to be, but they're not part of Liferay, so they don't suffer from the upgrade challenges that we've had in the past. All right, so let me get all this stuff set up. Oh, good. Yes. I had all this set up and then my system crashed. That's how it goes, isn't it? Okay. Now let's get my deck up here. So for the rest of the workshop, we're going to be talking about how to bring those custom applications that we might have into Liferay. The idea being that we are going to go to our team of front-end developers, our React folks, our Angular folks, our Vue folks. They may know absolutely nothing about Liferay, which is just fine. We don't expect them to know anything about Liferay, but we want to have those applications that they build for us, and then we want to deploy them to Liferay independently of each other. So the repo for what we're going to be building is up here. You can go ahead and access this, pull it down. There are two branches in there. There's the main branch, which is an unmodified version of the applications that we're going to be working on. There's also the completed branch, which is what I'm going to be showing you today, but it has all the steps already done, and then we can compare and contrast. The requirements are JDK 21, Node 20, and Yarn, and the Blade CLI. And I recommend that you do the Blade GW init bundle to download and set up your bundle, which I already have running. And now we get into the actual content. So, So a couple of things that I want to show. The first is, I found this website called To Do MVC. And basically, it's a site dedicated to really highlighting the differences between the different frameworks. But the advantage for me is it's the same application that's implemented in many different technologies. The idea here is the purpose of this workshop is to show you that we can take any JavaScript framework and convert that application into a custom element client extension. And we can take a look at these. Open this in a new tab. And it's a very simple application where you just go in and you can add your to-do items. As you put them in there, you can check them to mark that they're done. There's active links down here that we can see where it's changing the values that are visible. We can clear the completed. So it's a very simple application, which is fine. I don't really need anything to be complex. I just need to show how we're going to convert these into client extensions. I'm still using the test password, so I'm not the 1, 2, 3, 4 like Brian and stuff. Okay, so what I did is I started from the To-Do MVC repo. They have them all available in the examples directory. And these are all of the different frameworks that they have. So we can see that they have Angular and all the regular guys. React is down here, Vue.js is down here, but there's also a whole bunch that honestly I've never heard before. But that's okay. Using what we're going to learn here in the workshop, we could easily convert these into client extensions. From the repo, I'm going to start with my React one. And basically, I copied a bunch of those existing examples into my Liferay workspace. So I've copied in the Angular, JavaScript ES6, jQuery, Lit, React, React Redux, Svelte, which was new to me, and Vue, as well as web components. I copied all of these original guys into my repository, and in the main branch, they are unmodified, except they do contain 2 files. The first is the client extension.yaml file. That, of course, is going to make it a client extension. But there's also a liferay.markdown file. And the liferay.markdown file contains all of the changes that we need to make in each individual application to turn it into a client extension. Now, I did a blog on how to handle React. 5 easy steps for taking your React application to Liferay. That blog was based on using Vite and creating a new application and what you just needed to do with that application itself. When I come over to the to-do MVC, I can see that they're taking advantage of things that I did not use in my blog. This one is using Webpack for packaging all of the components. And with that, I can also look in the package.json, and I can see that they're also using Babel, which is okay. I don't do a whole lot with Babel myself, but it's fine that they're taking advantage of that, and a whole bunch of other plugins. This is okay, as long as it will build my prerequisites, as long as I can do the yarn install and yarn build to build the existing application, I know I'm at a good starting point. But from there, my modifications that I'm going to make in this application, I'm going to start with a package.json, and in here I just am going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to change the name to make sure it's unique, because I want to know that when I deploy this to Liferay, I'm not going to conflict with any other client extensions that have been deployed. So using a unique name, to me, I feel is important. This particular plugin application has a build script. When we look at package.json, it's using Webpack. So this guy doesn't have a build script. But I did change so that it was using dev. Well, not in this. It's one of my recommendations is to change it to dev. And if there's a test, I want to delete that because I'm not interested really in testing it in Liferay when I do the build. I'm going to take that out because I know the application is working. The next change I have to make is in the Webpack configuration. This one happens to have 2 files. There's a Webpack common. There's also a Webpack prod and dev for the 2 dev environments. But the common has shared information. And part of what I'm going to be doing in here is setting the library format. So here I'm saying I want to use UMD, or the Universal Module Definition. There is a public HTML file, so I'm going to go in here and make changes if I want to test it from within just a browser outside of Liferay. I do recommend modifying that to use your custom tag. That's not absolutely necessary, but it's useful for local testing purposes. But the biggest change that we're going to be making to the React application is we're changing the content of the file, and we can look at the original one here in just a second, but I'm now building a web component that extends HTML element, and it has code very similar to what I used in the blog post, but basically I'm creating and rendering a React application as part of the web component. And I have declared that my custom tag name is going to be React to do MVC. When we look at the original, the original index was just a basic React application where you expect to have just your render and then the hash router and the normal stuff. So what I'm doing in this particular change is going from a standard React application to a standard web component. That's what the change is in the index. And finally, I add a client extension YAML file, which I already have in the repo, so we don't have to copy and paste this in. But it is going to be something that we see repeated in all of our different applications. We're going to have an assemble statement indicating where the files are coming from that are going to build into the client extension. We have two important aspects that we need to include: the URLs for the JavaScript for the application. Because I'm using Webpack, it's going to be building a single JavaScript file called app.bundle.js. And there's also going to be a single CSS file that gets built for me called app.css. And how I find those values to enter come from the actual build itself. Yarn is going to run for me, but basically what I'm going to be looking for after it finishes, and it looks like it was successful, I'm going to be looking in the dist folder to see the files that it has generated for me. So when I go back in here, I can see that I have one JavaScript file, app.bundle.js, and one CSS file, app.css. So it's the built files that are important to me, the JavaScript and the CSS. If I have multiple files that I'm building, say I'm not using Webpack to pack them all into a single one, I end up with multiple JavaScript files or multiple CSS files. I'm just going to include those in my client extension.yaml file. So I'll repeat the CSS line to list each one of the CSS files. I'm going to repeat the URLs for each one of the JavaScript files. The JavaScript ones are important to keep the right order. You don't want to have them loading the wrong module first. I also set in the client extension YAML file what the name is. And to be consistent, I will always use my custom tag name for the name as well as for the friendly URL mapping, the HTML element name, and I'll be sure to give the name itself something that's understandable, because this is going to be what I'm going to see in the page editor when I want to use this component in a page. Now those are really the only things that we have to do. From the build perspective, we can use the yarn build command to build the application, but we're going to be using the GW deploy method, or I have in the markdown file, the blade GW build client extension zip, which is going to create your zip file, which you can then deploy to your SaaS, PaaS, or self-hosted. Locally, I did the GW deploy. And when I go to my React, I can see that my component is here. And it's working very much like what we expect from the application. There are some differences though. The CSS is not right. If I flip over, I would see that to-dos is actually centered, and it's in a larger font, and it's red. Some of the problems that we're going to run into is the application itself is going to be using CSS that conflicts with what Liferay's default CSS is going to be. So one of the things that we'll have to be aware of and change is likely going to be the CSS for the applications that we're given. Not significant changes, but ideally what we want to look for is adding something to make the rules in our application a higher specificity than what Liferay default CSS is going to apply. So that is the React component. There is another one, React Redux, that uses Redux for the internal state management. And we can see that this one is also using Webpack. There's a Babel config, so I know that it's using those. Otherwise, it's pretty much going to be the same kind of thing. So when we look in the Liferay markdown file for this guy, a lot of the changes that we're making in here are going to be basically the same, but there were some additional things that I needed to do. I needed to set up Babel in order to do the transforms for the JSX, and as well as the ES 2015 modules, because those pieces were not in there initially. Again, I modified the package JSON to fix the name to make sure that it was going to be unique, match my tag name, and be distinct from other client extensions that we might deploy. With that, again, I'm getting rid of the test script because when I'm doing the build in Liferay, I don't want to include the test step. I know that the application that I've been given is already tested and ready to go, so I don't concern myself with that. The big change is in the index.js file, and this is going to be very similar to what we saw before. We're changing from what is. If we go to look at the source code, it's just going to be a render, a standard React mount point using render. But we're changing it to use a custom HTML element, a custom web component. Again, with the callback to do the render for the mount and the unmount, as well as define our custom element name, which is React Redux to do MVC. Again, I recommend editing the public index.html file to change to use, and I have the wrong tag here, but change the user tag. That way, if you run it locally using yarn serve, you can see how the page reacts with the custom element in place in lieu of the React application. And finally, there is a client extension YAML file, which again, I'm doing the same kind of thing that I talked about the last time. So I have the assemble saying where the files are coming from. I'm listing my CSS URLs and my JavaScript URLs, and I have fixed the name to my tag, React Redux to do MVC, friendly URL mapping, HTML element name. These are all the same. And I also changed the name of the component so that it would match what I expect to find. And I have a page with this guy on. And if we go and look at the page, because I didn't show this before, but the element itself that I dropped on the page is named the same as what comes out of my client extension YAML file. So that's how I'm going to find my components to put in the form. And if I were to go to the add, because I've done a whole bunch of these, and I look for my to-do elements, you can see how they're all going to show up as client extensions that can be added to the page. There's already a React Redux on this page, so it's not going to let me do another one, but I could drop any of these others on the page if I wanted to. And the reason I can do that is because these are standard web components, and that's a feature of web components. They're self-contained. They deploy as a complete unit. They have all the dependencies that they need, either bundled inside or imported via JS import maps. But my Redux element, again, it works the same. There is some CSS differences that we're still seeing. Again, to-dos is not centered. It's not in the larger font. It's not red. And it looks like the shading is somewhat different in this version. So again, what we would have to do is modify CSS. Add some specificity to our CSS rules to bring them in. Now we're going to jump to the Angular app, and we can see that Angular is using TypeScript. There's a tsconfig line here, and when I check my package.json, I can see it's using ng for the build and start and everything. When I go to my Liferay markdown file, let's do the preview on this. The prerequisite, I didn't have ng installed, so I had to add the Angular CLI in my environment so that I could do the build, ng build, to build the Angular application. So I added this in here as a prerequisite. But once I had this in place, the next step was to do the modifications. And again, this is something that we've seen already before. Modify the package.json. Take away the test script, if there is one. For this one, I had to modify the Angular JSON because I needed to change the output hashing. In this case, I had to change output hashing from all to none because the output hashing was creating a random suffix on the generated files. And that was not something I could use in my client extension YAML file because I need to list the URLs that I'm importing or including in the client extension. So that was how I disabled those. And the big change was in the source main.ts. So this was the main file for the application. And you can almost see where we're going with this. We're importing create custom element. And that is absolutely what we end up doing. So we're creating a custom element, creating the application, providing the router. Toggle the element is creating the custom element with the app component. And then finally, we're defining it as Angular to do MVC. So we're starting to see a pattern here. What we're doing is we're taking these applications that we're given without really knowing much about them or the languages that they're implemented in. And really the challenge is just convert them into standard web components. That's what our Angular change is here that we're doing in main.ts, is we're changing it to a standard web component. And once we do that, we then have our client extension YAML file, which I happen to know that when we do the build of this guy, the artifacts are going to be in dist browser, and my files are going to be styles CSS. And this time I do have 3 different JavaScript files that I need to include. So they're all listed in the right load order so that they will not conflict with each other. And I have the same changes that I've been doing elsewhere. Tag name, tag name, tag name, and friendly name, so that I can pick it in the UI in order to place my application. Same steps that we've seen before. We would do the GW build client extension zip to build the zip file that we're going to deploy to the target environment. For local runtimes like I'm using here, I would just do the GW deploy, which is going to build and deploy my client extension into the environment. And I have already done that, and I have placed it on this page, and I can see that it is working. This one happens to be a little better with the CSS. I'm not sure why that is, other than I was playing around with it a little more. But the to-dos is centered, the to-dos is larger, the to-dos is red. It seems like the background color is not correct, so there are still some tweaks that we would want to do to the CSS beyond what I had already done. But again, it's going to be the same kind of thing. Try to raise the specificity of the CSS in your JavaScript application so it overrides what Liferay is going to be using by default. So that's my Angular guy. If we check any of these other ones, it's going to be the same kind of thing. When we look at the Liferay Markdown file, it's a repeat of what I've done before. The yarn build and yarn install and yarn build to make sure that the application will build. The modification in main.js, which we should see shortly. Package.json is, we're adding some pieces in here for handling the module declaration. So the UMD is the Universal Module Descriptor format, ES for ECMAScript. This guy is using Vite for the build. So there are changes that have been added into the file to take care of building the standard web component and packaging it all together. We can see that my change is adding the name in here for the friendly name and the formats for the library output in order to get the UMD format. The application itself is slightly modified. I added a div class around because I was trying to play with the CSS in order to raise my specificity. So I could use div and to-do app as my outer piece to raise the specificity and match on arguments. And the implementation of the application is very similar to what we've seen before, but this time it's done for Vue. So I'm still doing the custom element. In the constructor and in the connect, I'm basically creating the application and adding it into the page. but it is a standard web component. As we can see, the last line of the modification is defining the custom element as view to do MVC. I also have some other changes that I'm not going to go through, but things that I had to change in order to make the custom element work from this application. But when it comes time to do the client extension YAML file, repeat of what I've done before, the location that I'm pulling from, listing my URLs for the CSS and the JavaScript, tag name, tag name, tag name, and friendly name that I want to use for the component in the browser. And when I go to view, we can see that it is working. So the application is functioning, but again, styling is off. To-dos now looks like a link. Why that is, I'm not really sure, but it's not centered, it's not the right size, it's not the right color, so CSS is still an issue. But the important part is the application itself is working. Now, I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but I did convert regular vanilla JavaScript application to a standard web component so that I could make it a custom element and deploy the Liferay. I did the same thing for a jQuery version of the application, lit, Svelte, and there was also a standard web component that existed already that all I needed to do was actually go in and I kind of repackaged it so it was all one application. So, going through all this, it should be easy to see what we've had to do. Ultimately, it is the second bullet here. Convert the app into a standard web component. It's even better if your team of front-end developers is just building standard web components to start with. Then you're not going to have to make any changes. Additionally, CSS changes may be necessary. But again, if your front-end developers can keep the specificity rules in mind when they're building their application and creating their CSS, that can help you avoid having to make changes yourself after you package and deploy to Liferay. The first bullet is important and a matter of some discussion on the community Slack today, but avoid the use of the address bar and hash routing. Liferay owns the address bar. The to-do application, it actually uses the address bar and hashing for state, for transition, for managing the list of items to show. But if you navigate to another page and come back, all of your state management, all of your hash stuff, it's all gone. And Liferay itself, if you try to refresh the page, Liferay is going to choke because it's not going to recognize all of those routes. So it's important to avoid the use of the address bar and hash routing. For state management, you want to look at things like local storage in the browser, cookies, possibly using an object and pushing your state to the back end to retain it across different platforms, different browsers, etc. And this one was important. I mean, you might look at the list of applications that I changed and say, wow, Dave is awesome. He knows Svelte, he knows Vue, he knows Angular, he knows React, he knows Lit. And that would be completely false, right? I'm okay at React. I'm not an expert, but that's the one that I'm going to go to. The rest, I was really using AI. And the key was finding the right prompt. I would start with, I'm on a Mac and I'm using Yarn. I've been given an Angular application that uses Webpack and Babel, and I need to convert this into a standard web component. And using that prompt, it would give me the list of changes that I would need to make to the application to turn it into a standard web component. So for me, AI was really the key at making that list of applications possible. Because not knowing Vue, not knowing Angular, I wasn't going to be able to do those things on my own. But AI was a great help at making that possible. So I need to thank the To-Do MVC folks. I mean, that made it super easy. They gave me the application that worked on all those frameworks, so I didn't have to create one on my own. So that was a great help. Julian Murad, he is maybe not in here, but he's here at Devcon. He's going to be speaking soon. He helped me on the initial React version that I did for the blog. Mahmoud Tayyam, he's on our team. He's somewhere here today. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. But he helped me see the light about the standard web components, that every custom element client extension is basically a standard web component. And once that light went off, super easy to do the rest of this. And ChatGPT and Claude for helping me do the conversions. I had to use two of them because they were not equally good at doing the conversions. Claude would have helped me out with Vue, but ChatGPT really struggled with it. It gave me like 3 different rabbit holes that I went down, and it wasn't converting into a standard web component that was working. But Claude was able to do it for me. So you're going to want to try your different AI engines and see which one gives you the best results. But again, if your front-end developers can deliver standard web components, you don't have to worry about the conversion. But if they can't, these guys can help you with it. And that's it. I went 6 seconds over. But I'm here all day, so if you have questions, I'd love to answer them for you.